explain. Do you agree with what you've just heard?
I agree with a lot that both of them said, both Dr. Carson and Richard Dawkins. Dr. Carson said that when he looks at the human brain, he sees something that really distinguishes it sharply from all other creatures. It's not so much what he finds in the brain, it's what the brain can do. And I agree that the human species is really on a different plane from all other species. He uses the word spirituality. I would say it's because of language and culture, and that these are themselves evolved features of our world, and they can be studied using the Darwinian perspective. And that what we need to do now is to study, using the methods of science, just exactly the methods that we saw. For instance, Spencer Wells' wonderful map that opened his talk. We also need maps that trace human languages and human cultures. These are evolved products of the biosphere. They are fruits on the tree of life in exactly the same way that every organism and every apple is a fruit on the tree of life. When we study the evolution of faith, we learn many interesting things. My most recent book is about studying the evolution of faith and distinguishing rather sharply between the ancestral faiths, the faiths such as they must have been of those early humans moving out of Africa, and organized religions, which came along much later. They're a very recent phenomenon on the planet, only a few thousand years old, about the same age as agriculture, maybe 10,000 years at most. And there are adaptations. Religions have adapted to fit that wonderful human brain that we've heard so much about. And if we study religions, we can reverse engineer religions the same way we reverse engineer organisms and their parts. And we can learn from studying the evolution of faith how it's come to be such a powerful force in the world. And the reason that we need to do that is that in the 21st century, it is perhaps the most powerful social phenomenon. And if we don't understand it from top to bottom, we risk making some well-intentioned but terrible mistakes as we try to plot our future in this century.
Dr. Francis Collins successfully explained to my viewers in 1 minute and 40 seconds how he mapped the human genome and why that was significant. So I give you about the same amount of time to explain how your faith informs your science.
A tough challenge, Kathleen. It's a privilege to be on a panel with such distinguished presenters, and those of you listening to this conversation could probably not happen anywhere on the planet except right here. This is a very interesting aspect of this particular year's meeting. I have had the privilege of leading the effort that read out the 3 billion letters of the Human DNA Instruction Book, the Human Genome, working with thousands of scientists from all over the world. That is leading us in a fashion that I think we're all very excited about and has been referred to already this morning in terms of personalized medicine. The idea that each of us will be able, in the not too distant future, not only to know a little bit about various variants in our Y and chromosome or our mitochondria, but maybe our entire genome for less than $1,000. It's a very, very real possibility in the course of the next 10 or 15 years. So how are we going to deal with all that information? I'm also, though, in the 40% of my colleagues who believe in a God to whom one can pray in expectation of an answer. I'm a believer. I was not always so. I would have been very comfortable with Professor Dawkins and Dennet's positions until I was 27, because I was an atheist for most of my younger life. And what brought me to a change in that view was a realization that I'd never really considered the evidence for and against faith. And so, when challenged about that while I was a medical student, I decided I ought to know a little bit more about what exactly faith represents. And I discovered that many of my ideas about what faith is were actually caricatures of the real thing. In my view, faith only is defensible if it carries with it an intellectual logic and rationale. But you can't get all the way to faith purely on the basis of intellect. There still has to be that leap where you make that decision. But certainly, I would agree with what's already been said. What matters here is the truth. Either there is a God or there is not. If there is not, then let's not waste our time spending all these conversations and altering our lives in accordance with that assumption. But if there is, there can be no more important reality in any of our lives than that. What I realize is that science is not really an effective way to approach that question. Science explores the natural world. It is the only way to understand the natural world effectively. Its tools are designed for that. If God exists, then God cannot, in my view, be enclosed by the natural world. God is at least in part outside of that. And that tells you that the tools of science are not going to be effective in determining his existence or lack thereof. There must be other ways to pursue that. One of the compelling arguments which I continue to be drawn to, and which was put forward for me most effectively by the Oxford scholar C.S. Lewis, is the argument about the moral law. Why is it that we, of all the creatures on the planet, have this knowledge of what is right and wrong, even though we regularly don't adhere to that law? But we know it, and that's true of all cultures down through history. What is that about? Because I think one can argue that that moral law sometimes calls you to do things that are absolutely contrary to what Darwinian evolution would expect of you in terms of propagating your own DNA. And I find that to be a very interesting argument. I would not hang my faith on it, but I think it's an interesting argument. For me, science is one way of knowing. Faith is another way of knowing. I find no difficulty in having both of those coexist within me at any given moment, including right now. In that way, science becomes not only a way of discovering the natural world, but also a way of worshiping a God who had something to do with getting the whole thing going. My view, as far as evolution, is it's the only way to understand biology. It is absolutely incontrovertibly true in terms of our descent from a common ancestor. But I'm a theistic evolutionist. If God chose to use that mechanism to create you and me and everything else we see on this wonderful planet, who are we to say that wasn't an elegant means of creation? It's an incredibly elegant way to accomplish the goal. And for God, who is not limited in space or time, the apparent randomness of the process to us, because we're limited on that time axis, is not randomness to him. So for me, the God of the genome is also the God of the Bible. You can find him in a cathedral, or you can find him in a laboratory. And I am deeply troubled by the polarization that exists right now, especially in this country, between the extreme perspectives which say there can be no God because evolution has disproved it, and the creationist view which says evolution has to be wrong. You have to disbelieve what science is telling you with great, compelling rigor. There needs to be a recovery of the middle ground, where we always were down through the centuries, and which we seem to have lost in recent times. Not because we just decide it's too awkward to have the conversation, but because the conversation leads us to a happy harmony, which is where I have found great peace and great comfort.
We're going to open up this debate to those of you in the audience, and so if you want to start assembling at these microphones, you can start doing that right now. Meanwhile, you know, as you hear this debate, so often you hear that scientists are really concerned that the power of religious groups is blocking further scientific research. Is that something, Dr. Carson, that you're concerned about, a trend in that direction?
Well, there's no question that one has to recognize that there is a difference between faith, which is, I think, what Dr. Collins was talking about, and religion. Two very different things. And, you know, over the course of history, many religions have sprung up that really don't have a whole lot to do with my personal concept of a loving creator. They have a lot to do with how do you control people and how do you acquire power unto yourself. And this continues to be the case today. And I think, you know, the religious bodies have to be held to a higher standard. They do, in fact, have to deal with logic. They do have to deal with the things that are placed on the table by the evolutionists as well as other people. But I would caution and say also that the people who try to discard God